and it's 4:15 now, so I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon. And those of you who have just joined us, because I saw the numbers increase dramatically in the last few seconds here, and welcome again. My name is Laverne Gray, and I will be chairing the session. I am an assistant professor in the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University, and I welcome all of you here. Some of you who were here earlier put where you're from, just a quick hello in the chat, and I encourage you to do so, just so we know who's represented. We have many folks from Florida, so they are well, and Colorado. We have two from Colorado, and so they're well represented. So so it's a nice mix here. I'll call it a mix, and just to let you know, and you can see on the first slide here that this session, just to make sure you're in the right place, is a rising of informal women's learn to code communities, activity systems as incubators. And I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then I encourage you to place your questions in the chat as they arise. And at that time, when we call for questions at the end of the talk, there will be a link to the slides and also a comment space placed in the chat to a Google Doc. So we will be monitoring that in terms of questions also, but that lets you follow along and understand the content better. So, oh, hello, New Mexico and Georgia and Arizona. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Louise or Luann Lyon. She's a senior research affiliate at ETR, focusing on broadening participation in computing in formal post-secondary and informal workplace-focused settings. Dr. Lyon received her PhD in learning sciences with the graduate certificate in feminist studies from the University of Washington. Prior to completion of her PhD, Dr. Lyon was a member of the computer science faculty at the University of Washington Tacoma campus. Prior to that, Dr. Lyon completed a MS in computer science and engineering at California State University, Chico, and worked for a number of years as a software engineer. So she brings a lot of rich experience. Like to welcome Dr. Lyon and turn it over to her. And please keep your mics muted as she speaks. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Laverne, and welcome everyone, as she said. This project that I'll be talking about today came about from my interest in women that are in the workplace and who discover an interest in learning to code. So they start to try to teach themselves, in many cases, how to write computer code. And the title of my talk, when I mention incubators, what seems to be happening is women are forming these all women's groups because they feel that it will be a place to learn skills where it's less threatening than some of the male dominated settings of computer science. And then they'll be able to take that learning into the workplace and feel more confident once they arrive there. So the motivation for this research, I started at ETR, which is a small nonprofit here near Santa Cruz, California, in 2014. And we had an IT person that worked with me at ETR, and she approached me about a group that she was starting. So ETR as an organization was using what's called the Salesforce software platform. So Salesforce is a company that offers software that's in the cloud, and we were using that at ETR. She had been an administrator on that software, and now she wanted to learn how to code in order to help her configure the software for our business needs at ETR. And she'd been trying to teach herself, which she said to me she'd been finding it difficult. So what she had done, She went to one of the big Salesforce meetings. So they have a big meeting every year where people come from all different companies and talk about their use of Salesforce at their company. She went to one of these meetings and talked with some women there about starting their own coaching and learning group so that they could help each other learn to code. So that's how this started. Was she came to me and said, I'm doing this volunteer group. Are you interested? And I said, yes, I would be interested in studying that. So I wrote an NSF grant and got funding to actually study the group. The context for this research, so as I mentioned, Salesforce Incorporated sells a customer relationship management platform. And this software is a centralized database. So different companies, they pay Salesforce to access a database where they keep their own customer information. And they can write in their own applications and they can customize it based on their particular business needs. What's especially was interesting for this work is that Salesforce encourages employees of all the different companies that use their platform to connect with each other. So they help create a space for people across companies to actually talk to each other about how to use the software. So they have meetups within Salesforce that people from different companies can join. They have classes in person and online, and they have forums where people can ask and answer questions. And these communities then in general are divided up by job function. So you have certain groups that are for administrators, and Salesforce administrators at companies all around the world can communicate with each other. Or then developers can get together and communicate with each other. The programming language used on the Salesforce platform is called Apex. So it is Apex that, when I speak of Apex, that's the language that's being used that these women were learning to code in. It's similar to Java. So the setting for this was a women's virtual coaching and learning group. So even before the pandemic and before we all went virtual, they started this virtual coaching and learning group where and it was all volunteers. So they had these volunteer coaches that were more knowledgeable in Apex, and they would lead learners through this 10-week series of classes where they would practice different skills in Apex. Each week over those 10 weeks. And they could communicate with each other, and they would give them kind of homework assignments, so things they do on their own, and then they come back together and present and answer questions and so on. So that's what the setting was for this work that I did. And this coaching and learning community then was inside of the larger, what was called the Salesforce Success Community. So where people that were using Salesforce at different companies could communicate with each other and share information, answer questions, share tips, and so on. So they had this as sort of a backup or a way to have resources that were available to Salesforce users more broadly. And so some of the resources Salesforce, the company, offered for women and their learning. So one thing, and I think this setting is interesting because it's across companies, and yet people are pulled together because they're using this same software. So some of the things that were offered were badges and certificates in Apex. So women could post on their LinkedIn or other social media when they had a certain level of knowledge in the Apex language, and they would get badges or certificates through Salesforce. So that was a way that they could advertise their knowledge in Apex. And many people use that to find jobs, right? Because then it would say, I have a certain level of knowledge in Apex. And so companies that were looking to hire someone with that knowledge, it was a way for them to reach out. Salesforce also offered single and multi-day classes. So for example, at their big annual trade show / conference, you could sign up to take classes to learn Apex. Salesforce also offered online tutorials and discussion boards. So they had online learning materials that were tutorials that women could do on their own time to learn Apex. And then if they had questions, they could post questions in discussion boards and get answers from others who were knowledgeable in Apex. They also provided an Apex developer guide. So more, if you're familiar with developer guides, it's more like a dictionary, right? If you know certain terms and you look it up and it gives a description about how things are used. For my larger project, there's information on the Informal Science website. So if anybody's interested during or after this presentation, you could go to informalscience.org. You could search for my last name, Lyon, and look for the title of the project. And on there is a summative evaluation of the project and also some graphics that I created to illustrate some findings from the larger project. But for purposes of this talk today, I'm focusing on a paper I wrote that's in the special issue of Transactions on Computing Education. So their Reset special issue, I have a paper in there, and that's what I'm talking in more detail about today. So for this project, I was interested in both the individuals that were learning to code, so these women that are in the workplace and are finding that they need to learn to code, and the environment itself. So the environment of others learning Apex, the environment of Salesforce, and the other people that use Salesforce, and so on. I was interested in kind of both those levels. So I conceptualized the study using activity theory. So you can see here the diagram that's often used to show kind of activity theory and the pieces of activity theory that you can focus on when doing data analysis. So we have both individual level, so it's the subjects, or in this case, the women that are learning Apex. They have certain objects or motives for what they're doing. There's tools that they use to accomplish this motive. But then we also, underlying that, we have the community. We have other people, and in that community, rules and division of labor. And so an activity system such as this, these can be either, like the rules can be either explicit or tacit. So it can either be they say these are the rules that we're following in this community, or it can be things that appear as you study the community. My research question in this study was, how does a grassroots informal learning community for women nurture the knowledge and confidence of participating novice software developers? So that's the research question I focused on for this particular paper. Data collection, I used an ethnographic approach. So data collection was several different types of data. First of all, I was a participant observer in a 10-week series of classes. So I sat in on each of the classes during the 10 weeks. I did the homework in between the class sessions and so on. Secondly, I did hour-long interviews. So first of all, I did interviews with the learners. So there were multiple series of classes going on at the same time. So I was participant observer in one, but there were other coaching learning groups happening at the same time. So I did interviews with learners from all the groups that were happening at that time. And I interviewed them at 3 time points. So at the very start, before they'd really done any of the classes, at the end of the 10-week series, so when they were finishing, and then again 6 months after the classes, so that I could see what had happened later on. I also did interviews with some of the coaches and organizers of the group. Also, during the 10-week series of classes, I did think alouds with participants. So that consisted of spending an hour where they would be working on their homework and verbalizing their thinking as they were working on their homework. So I would watch, observe them, take notes, and I also recorded those sessions. And then I also collected class materials and forum postings. So the materials they used in class, such as PowerPoint slides and so on. And also then they had their own forums so that people, the coaches and learners could all ask questions or communicate with each other and post their homeworks, the responses and so on. So I also collected all of that from this 10-week series. And so then data analysis for this then again was following this activity systems analysis. So as you can see, and the green boxes here, those are the pieces I'm going to go into in a little more detail. But you can see that then the subjects were administrators who were learning to code. So that meant that the women that were doing this had some knowledge about the Salesforce platform. So they already knew how to set up the database and get information out of the database and so on. So they knew basically how to administer the software for their particular company. But then what happened many times is they got to the place where they could not do a customization that they needed. So at that point, they would either become interested in coding themselves. So a lot of the women here, they wanted to be able to make those further customizations where they worked, or in some cases, they were overseeing external developers. So they had hired developers that were doing this customization for them, but these women were uncomfortable with the fact that they didn't know anything about the code. So they decided to learn some coding so that they could understand what the developers that they were overseeing were doing. So those were some of their motives. So you see then on the right side here, they had motives where either they wanted to write code and in some cases become developer themselves, or they just simply wanted to be able to read code and oversee developers that were working for them. So at the bottom you see is the community of organizers. So we had a group, it was I think about 3 or 4 women that organized all this. And then they found coaches who were volunteers who were willing to help other women. And then they put out the word through the Salesforce community and they found learners, and they actually had to do a lottery system. There were enough women interested in learning that they actually had to sign up, and then they chose women that, for however much room they had in the coaching sessions that they were going to conduct. The division of labor in this group then, learners were set up as students, if you think of a more formal kind of environment, and coaches were set up really as instructors, I would say. The coaches and learners were across the US and even internationally. So the group that I was involved in, one of the coaches actually was in Spain. So she was a coach from Spain. The other one, I guess, was in Portland. And then we had students that were across the US. The outcomes then for these women, there was a range. So a couple of women did indeed become full-time developers. So they finished this series of classes. They got, in some cases, certifications. They took the tests and got certified as Apex developers, and they got jobs as full-time developers. So that was one end of the spectrum. On the other side, there were women that just didn't have the time to do any further learning, and they pretty much got stalled. So they had learned some things, but just ran out of time and resources and whatever to continue learning. So by the 6 months after these classes, some really hadn't changed. They just had some more knowledge. So next I'll go into a little more detail about the tools and the rules. So I'll be talking about how the tools for the women, in this informal setting, they were really looking for examples that they could use and modify. So they wanted something that was as close to what they needed to do as possible. I also found that it was tricky for them to use the developer guide. I think because they didn't know what terms to search on, and then when they found something, they weren't sure how to read the syntax of the coding, so they weren't sure exactly how to use it. And also there's a trick, anytime you are in this type of a situation, it's tricky to take the knowledge you have that's more theoretical, right? And then how to actually apply it. So it was a trick for them, now that I know some of these things, how do I actually apply it to my business needs? So that was tricky for them. What was interesting about the rules of this group was they didn't talk about this, but what emerged from this was that specifically it seemed, in contrast to the male-dominated settings, that's true in many software development environments, is the women felt it was more comfortable to ask questions. So when it was all women learners, they were more comfortable asking questions than when they went to a class and it was so many men in the class. Then they were intimidated to ask questions. Or even online, they talked about the fact that when they would post a question on a forum, a developer forum, the males sometimes would come back and say, read the effing manual, right? So they would shame them for asking a beginning question. So they were making this a comfortable place for women to ask questions. And then another piece of that was, of these rules that were in contrast to male-dominated settings, were the supportive and inclusive environment. And lots of times that was described by the women as people giving verbal support. So women, unsolicited women, they said, were more likely to say, you can do this. You're doing a great job, and those kinds of things. So that, again, in contrast to where they'd been in places where it was a lot of men, they found the women were more likely to give them that kind of support and encouragement. So some of the quotes then from this work. So as far as the rules and the comfort in asking questions, Trinity, for example, said, because it's women, we can share experiences, and you don't have that cold answer from some guy who doesn't really want to give you the answer. Natalie said, I had my doubts at the beginning, but I do feel more comfortable working with other women. So she was one. Then she said, especially when I'm not sure about topics or when I have to speak or ask questions. So Natalie was one that when I had asked her at the beginning, before the 10-week session at the start, I said, does it make a difference to you that it's all women? She said, no, it doesn't make a difference at all. But then by the end of the 10 weeks, this is what she had said about that she did find it was a more comfortable environment. And Rebecca said then about this supportive environment, she said, we were doing our educated guesses with definitions and things like that. And I think because it was all women, we felt okay to do that. Even when we were wrong, nobody shamed anybody else, the coaches or anybody else. They said, well, sort of, or, well, it's actually da-da-da. I think that it was a very supportive environment. And I think it came top down. The coaches set up a very inclusive, very warm environment, and the students kind of fell along in that mentality. So again, women felt that, and sometimes they contrasted it to male-dominated settings, that it was more supportive and encouraging having a group of all women. So they felt more comfortable there for their learning. As far as the tools go, as I mentioned, learners looked for examples similar to what they were trying to accomplish. So the organizers had put together a series of PowerPoint slides and homework activities for the learners to do. And so this was the first place they go to pull from to use examples. So Kate, for example, said, and Kate actually had a background in computer science. So she had done computer science many years before. So she came up to speed more quickly because this was similar to what she'd done. But she said, I always like to look at examples so I don't have to type it all out. I never like to do anything from scratch. I'm going to always steal it. So that's how she put it when she was looking for examples that were similar to what she wanted to do. Natalie said, and Natalie was a real beginner, she struggled the most. She said she spent, I don't know, like 40 hours a week trying to do homework problems and things. I mean, she was spending tons of time on this. And she said, it's easier for me to look at examples. I didn't realize how much I rely on the examples to help me figure things out. So again, this seemed to be the resource that these women went to try to help in their learning. And I noticed, especially being an observer who has a computer science background, how little they use the developer guide. They really struggled with that. They didn't find it as useful. So once they were done with the classes and they were back on the job, not all women were able to reach their goals. So as I mentioned, 2 women actually did become developers, but other women, like this example, they stalled in their learning apex. So she said she didn't have a real world problem to continue to say, well, I learned this foundation, how do I apply it? And say, these were all the pieces, and now take it and put it into something. So again, she was struggling to find problems that were the right size, that she could solve them, and she could actually take what she had learned and apply it to her particular business problem. So in her case, actually, she owned her own consulting company with her partner. And since he had a coding background, she just had him do the coding, and she stayed with more of the kind of sales and marketing as it ended up. So some takeaways from this. In order to create a supportive environment for women learning software development, you need to create a comfortable environment for asking questions and offering abundant verbal encouragement. So again, women were finding that, in contrast to some of the male-dominated settings, that it was important for them and for their learning that they felt comfortable asking questions, and it also was encouraging to them to receive verbal encouragement. And it's interesting, at the time I did the participant observation in this, they actually by then had accepted a male coach. So I actually talked with a male coach as well, and he said that he specifically tried to offer this verbal encouragement. So he said, as that quote said earlier, if somebody said something that was incorrect, he wouldn't just say, no, that's wrong, it's this. He would say, well, think about it this way. And he would encourage them, and he was specifically trying to do that. So even if it's males in the group, perhaps if they offer that, women feel more comfortable. Second of all, informal workplace learners value examples to copy and modify. So they will take examples and use those in their learning, and sometimes will struggle with the reference type developer guides. And finally, it's difficult for learners, once they go back on the job, to find tasks they can do that are the proper difficulty. And of course, it's also difficult for them to have time to continue learning. So as you can imagine, you go back into the workplace, you have a lot of things you need to be doing, and it's difficult to have the time to spend to actually continue learning on the job. So thank you. And I guess now back to Laverne to facilitate the question portion, if my understanding is correct.
Yes, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. This is quite fascinating to see the grassroots efforts in development of women in this area. I'm going to open it up 2 questions now, so please place your questions in the chat. Um, and while you are thinking about that, I'm going to just start us off by asking about the whole idea of 2 words I jotted down: comfort and support. And what did that mean for the women engaged in these informal environment? And then I'll get to the next question. Thank you.
Sure.
Mhm.
The comfort seemed to be largely around this question asking. So what women reported was, and it wasn't all women that said this. So some women said it makes no difference if there's a lot of men. Although some women would say it makes no difference because I've been in that environment and I'm used to it. so, so women kind of, I think, you say women, right? But they have different responses also to these things. So, but it seemed that it came out that women want to be comfortable asking questions, and they worry that men have, first of all, more experience in coding, because there's this kind of image that it's men that know how to code. So they worry that if they ask a question, a stupid question or a novice question, that they will be shamed for that.
Mhm.
And so they want to be in a place where they feel comfortable. And for some, not all, that is more comfortable when it's all women. And the support comes from that the other people being encouraging, right?
Mhm.
And telling them you can do this and showing confidence in them, right? That they can do this. And that seems to then, they feel that that's supportive, and that helps also with the comfort.
Right. Thank you. I do have follow-up, but I will turn it over to our attendees. The first question, and thank you for the response. It got my wheels turning.
Okay.
From Athena Scarlett, her question is, how can college female students do something like this in college?
Mm. Well, I would say one thing is, I think it's important to get the word out to instructors
Mm.
that this verbal encouragement is important to women, and it doesn't matter if the instructors are male or female,
Mhm.
that they should give this kind of unsolicited verbal encouragement, especially to women, if they want them to feel comfortable in the classroom. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing would be, I think it's great when women, and this, you see it a lot, that women form these women in computer science or women coders, those kinds of groups, because then if they make it a place where women can ask questions of each other, then it's a place that they can further their learning in perhaps a more comfortable environment.
Mhm. Mhm. All right, thank you. Yeah, it is a great model to follow. And the next question was from Maria uh, Rodriguez. Did this lead to more women's tech learning groups? Or was it isolated? That's a terrific question.
Um, it seems like in general that since people that are using the Salesforce platform, they're communicating with each other,
Mhm.
it seems like they are forming their own groups. And this also happens outside of Salesforce. Like here where I live in Santa Cruz area of California, there was a meetup that I started attending about women that were coding, learning to code, and they formed this women's group where they could also help each other. So it does seem like this is something that arises naturally, that women seem to reach out in these different settings to be able to help each other learn to code.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah, and please do feel free to enter your questions in the chat. And the whole notion, and Maria, thanks you for your response. And the whole notion of around these women coming together um, made me think about women's ways of knowing and
Mm,
the importance of collectives.
right.
Um, and and how important that is. And I'm going to read out something in the chat from Helen Rodriguez. I agree with girls working with girls because I sometimes feel misplaced working with guys in my class. And sometimes they make me feel like I don't have the knowledge of the topic, and they do.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to respond to that, I'll say right on, Helen, but if you want to respond to that, Dr. Lyon.
Well, it's interesting because another thing that that happens in the classroom, in the computer science classroom, that women report on is that, you know, and again, not always, but sometimes it's the men, they ask more advanced questions. So, you know, and I've done other studies where women say the men sort of show off, right? They ask these sort of show-offy questions. So it just seems to be a different style, right? And so when the classroom is dominated by these male students, sometimes they have these other ways of being in the classroom that can be uncomfortable for some women.
Definitely, definitely, and in the worksapace.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, another comment we have from Naomi Smith said, "I love this research. I'm minoring in gender studies and majoring in computer science. Is there any places you see these intersecting that you would recommend checking out, career-wise, research-wise, or internship-wise?"
I guess I don't know about anything specifically, but certainly with this rise in interest in broadening participation in computer science, there is a lot of conversation about underrepresented groups in computer science. So it's women, it's also underrepresented minorities or minoritized people. And so it seems to me there are places to combine those interests because there's a lot of talk about how do we diversify computer science and computing.
Yeah, and then the whole idea of partnering gender studies with computer science and you know, gender and ethnic studies, however you want to go about it, and understanding the humanistic complexities of technology is quite powerful, and continue to pursue that. Research-wise, your options are endless, as noted by this fabulous presentation, and is the same with career. It's a great need for that combination.
I agree.
Yeah. And Amber, I'm just going to read them out. So thank you so much for the presentation. I really like this data we can look out at. Okay. Thank you. And another a comment by Amber was, one thing I've learned from personal experience is that speaking up is something we need to be encouraged other women to do. Be loud. Be loud. Yeah. And be aware of your environment and speak up in it. Wow. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. These are such wonderful, wonderful comments and questions. And Maria Rodriguez asks, Dr. Lyon, what is your area of study?
Well, let's see. I have a bachelor's degree in art history. I have a master's degree in computer science. So I actually studied computer science and then worked in software engineering. And then my PhD is in learning sciences, which is in the education department. So learning sciences is basically how people learn both in and out of school. So there's a focus on out of school settings. And along with my PhD, I got a certificate in feminist studies. So that also was part of my PhD.
Yeah, that's a wonderful combination.
Yes, it's worked out well.
Yeah. And Naomi, this is another comment, said that men will often say anything that will come to their mind, but I always want to hear what the women have to say.
Yeah.
And I will, just grab the mic here for a moment and talk about, in my research, the metaphor of voice and women, and speaking up and breaking silences, and what that means in, feminist context, and Black feminist context, and in feminist context, and how that is a part of developing oneself and knowledge and learning. And as that increases, so does the voice, apparently,
Right.
and the whole notion of speaking out. Thank you so much for that.
The other thing I would say, again, in a previous study I did, women
Mhm.
talk about that when men do speak, they act like they know what they're talking about, even when they're wrong. Whereas women will say things more hesitantly.
Yeah,
And so it seems like they don't have confidence, or maybe they aren't right. So it's also not only speaking out, but how you say something.
exactly, exactly. The frame of the voice.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah. And Maria commented again that she loves your educational journey is inspiring. Yeah, yeah, and explore and it explore all of those areas that your interests lie in. It doesn't have to be a straight line. And Dr. Lyon's experience shows the beauty of blending
Right.
uh, disciplines and points of view and theories in developing research and helping people also. So, and Tori Messmore, could we speak in terms of most men rather? I think we may be drawing too dark of lines here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to expand on that? You can unmute, Tori.
Yeah, I just think a lot of what's being said is like men act this way and women act this way. And I think there's just like a lot of blur in between as well. I think there are a lot of women that can be condescending to other women. I think there are a lot of men that can be very understanding of it as well. So if we could just kind of address that blur as well. I don't want to be like speaking in huge generals and saying that like every male on my campus is acting this horrible way, because I just don't know if that's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that. It belies what and I'm going to use this word tropes, tropes sometime in expression. And I really appreciate that observation. Um, and and also to note when I speak, or not me because I didn't do the presentation, but and sometimes it's uh, associated with theoretical work around feminist research, that these categories come up. And I thank you so much for that observation. And I do agree with you, agree with that. Do you want to speak on that, Dr. Lyon?
Yeah, it's obviously there's a range, right, for both. And I mean, this is also, we're being binary in this, right, with the men and women thing. So, but yeah, it's just a little bit of a shorthand when you're trying to do a presentation. You only have so much but time. But yes, thank you for bringing that up, because that's certainly something we need to keep in mind
and be conscious of. And thank you for raising my consciousness, or raising our consciousness in that area. Much appreciated. Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. Do I have one other question? One more, we have time for one more. Okay. Well, I just want to thank the speaker, Dr. Lyon, and encourage you all. And if you could provide the website again. I think you had an informal.
It was Informal Science.
Yes, Informal Science. It's on this slide here, and the Google Doc link to this presentation. I will place it in the chat again so you have access to it there. And please feel free to comment there. And if you have Other questions for Dr. Lyon? Please indicate it there. And thank you so much for attending. This was wonderful. The parallels with my own research are just astonishing, but mine is historic, and it looks at Black women in public housing and their information settings. So, and informal learning is a part of that. So I really appreciate this presentation, this talk. Wonderful.
Thank you, Laverne.
And many thank yous coming through the chat. And everyone have a nice evening or late afternoon, depending on what coast you're on. All right. Yeah. So, and that closes us out. So thank you again, Dr. Lyon.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And just a note, the classic text, Women Ways of Knowing. And there was a follow-up text called The Tradition That Has No Name. And it focused on this learners partnership program in working with women in communities and them learning to transform their community space. So it's a wonderful text you might want to check out.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, The Tradition That Has No Name.
Okay.
And it made me think of that when you were presenting, this tradition that's not named.
Right.
Okay. Well, thank you again and have a great evening.
Okay, you too.
All right. Bye-bye. Thank you, Tasfia.
No problem. Have a great evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.